HOA tried to make me lower my fence. I built a giant hedge maze instead. It became a town landmark. The HOA lost. Don't mess with a man's property, or his maze. Suburbia. Oak Gardens, to be precise. Yeah, I know, sounds all fancy and stuff. But it's your typical cookie-cutter neighborhood. Manicured lawns, houses painted in various shades of beige. Seriously, I think the HOA has a beige fetish. And everyone trying desperately to keep up with the Joneses. Except me. My place is, well, it's a little different. It's still a suburban lot. I'm not living on some sprawling ranch or anything. But it's a bit bigger than the others. Like maybe a quarter-acre instead of the postage stamp-sized lots everyone else has. It gives me a little more breathing room, which is nice. And it means I have a bit more creative license when it comes to landscaping. Now, the fence. It wasn't anything crazy, just a standard wooden privacy fence. You know the kind, 6 feet tall, keeps the nosy neighbors from peeking into your backyard, that sort of thing. It was perfectly legal, built to code, all that jazz. Nothing outrageous, nothing that would make anyone bat an eye, just a fence. But here's the thing about Oak Gardens. They're all about uniformity. Everything has to be just so. Lawn height has to be precisely 2.5 inches. Mailboxes have to be a specific shade of green. And of course, fences have to conform to their aesthetic guidelines, which basically means they have to be short, boring, and preferably invisible. The rest of the neighborhood? Yeah, they're all on board with this. They've got their little manicured lawns, their little identical fences, their little beige houses. It's all very predictable. And honestly, a little creepy. It's like living in a Stepford Wives movie, except instead of creepy smiles, everyone just has a slightly constipated look on their face from trying so hard to maintain their perfect suburban facade. Me? I prefer a little more personality, a little more uniqueness, which, as I soon found out, the HOA doesn't appreciate at all. Okay, so the HOA. These guys, I swear, they're like a bunch of hyper-organized, beige-obsessed ants. Their entire existence revolves around making sure everyone's lawn is the exact same shade of green and that no one dares to express even a hint of individuality. They're obsessed with property values, which, in their minds, means everything must look exactly the same so that rich people will want to move here and make us all richer. It's a whole thing. They've been a thorn in the side of Oak Gardens since they were formed, probably. I've heard stories. The great flowerbed fiasco of 18, the mailbox color catastrophe of 20, the infamous excessive bird feeder incident of 22. They've targeted everyone, from the sweet old lady who dared to plant petunias instead of pansies, to the guy who had the audacity to park his boat in his own driveway. It's like they have nothing better to do than police everyone's landscaping and nitpick the smallest infractions. Power hungry doesn't even begin to describe it. It's more like they're on a mission to create a perfectly uniform, utterly soulless suburb. And of course, they finally came for me. The fence fracas, as I now call it. It started, as these things always do, with a letter. A crisp, white, official-looking letter, delivered by the mailman like some kind of legal summons. I knew the second I saw it what it was. The HOA, of course. I opened it up, and there it was, in all its infuriating glory. Polite, but firm. Dear Mr. Altman, it began, because they always use my full name, like I'm some kind of criminal. It has come to the attention of the Oak Gardens Architectural Harmony Committee. Yes, they actually have a committee for this. That your privacy fence is in violation of Section 4, Subsection B, Paragraph 12 of the Oak Gardens Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, CC and Rs. CC and Rs. Seriously? Who even reads these things? Apparently, the HOA does. And they memorize them, and they use them to make everyone's lives miserable. I kept reading, and it got worse. Specifically, the letter continued, your fence exceeds the maximum allowable height of 6 feet and does not conform to the required setback from the property line. 6 feet? Setback. These guys were nitpicking inches, and then the kicker. Furthermore, the letter stated, The use of wood as a fencing material is not permitted within oak gardens. All fences must be constructed of vinyl or other approved synthetic materials. Vinyl? Seriously? They wanted me to replace my perfectly good, sturdy wooden fence with some cheap, plastic-looking vinyl fence? Because that's aesthetically pleasing? The whole thing was infuriating. The fence was perfectly legal, according to actual city ordinances. But the HOA, in their infinite wisdom, had their own, stricter, more ridiculous rules. Rules designed to make everyone's lives as bland and uniform as possible. Rules designed to make me want to scream. And that's when I decided I wasn't just going to lower my fence. I was going to get rid of it entirely and replace it with something they couldn't possibly complain about. Something unexpected, something maze-like. Okay, so the HOA wanted a fence war? Fine. They wanted aesthetics? Even better. But they weren't going to get some meek, compliant homeowner meekly lowering their perfectly legal fence. No way. I'm not about to let a bunch of beige-obsessed busybodies dictate what I can and can't do with my own property. 6 feet tall, huh? I muttered to myself, rereading the infuriating letter. Vinyl only, huh? Yeah, right. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it in the trash. I'll show them aesthetics, I thought. The decision was made right then and there. I wasn't just going to lower the fence. I was going to remove it entirely and replace it with something far more interesting, something maze-like. The idea sparked in my mind like a lightning bolt. A hedge maze. A giant, sprawling, magnificent hedge maze right there in my front yard. It was perfect. It was audacious. It was exactly the kind of aesthetic statement the HOA would absolutely hate. I started planning immediately. This wasn't going to be some dinky little maze. This was going to be a maze. A labyrinth of leafy goodness, a verdant puzzle for the ages. I envisioned winding paths, hidden fountains, secret seating areas, maybe even a mini library tucked away in the center. I spent hours researching online. I looked at different maze designs, from classic circular mazes to intricate geometric patterns. I even considered adding a dead-end section with a statue of a gnome, just to troll the HOA. Then the hedges. I needed the right kind of hedges. Something tall, dense, and preferably thorny, just to add an extra layer of challenge and maybe deter any unwanted HOA inspections. I spent days researching different varieties, reading reviews, and consulting with local nurseries. I finally settled on a combination of fast-growing privet and some extra thorny hawthorn, just for kicks. The scale of the maze was ambitious. It was going to take up a significant portion of my front yard, encroaching on what the HOA probably considered prime lawn space. But I didn't care. This wasn't just about getting back at the HOA. This was about creating something awesome, something that would make people smile, something that would add a little bit of whimsy to the otherwise beige landscape of Oak Gardens, something that would make Mrs. Anderson's head explode. And that, my friends, was worth every thorn prick and every aching muscle. Okay, so, after weeks of digging, planting, and pruning, and a few minor injuries involving rogue thorns, the maze was finally finished. It was glorious. A sprawling labyrinth of green. A verdant puzzle that transformed my front yard into something magical. It was way bigger than I initially planned, but hey, go big or go home, right? I decided to have a grand opening. I mean, why not? I sent out flyers to everyone in Oak Gardens, including, of course, a very special invitation to Mrs. Anderson and the HOA board, announcing the unveiling of Altman's Amazing Maze. I even set up a little makeshift stage for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I figured I might as well go all out. The day of the grand opening was, well, it was something else. People showed up. Lots of people. I'm talking the whole town and then some. Kids were running around, excited to explore the maze. Neighbors were chatting and laughing. Even some local businesses showed up, offering free samples of their products. It was like a block party, but with a giant hedge maze as the centerpiece. I stood on the little stage, feeling a bit overwhelmed by the crowd. I grabbed the giant ceremonial scissors, because why not, and cut the ribbon, officially opening the maze to the public. And then, chaos. In the best possible way. Kids were the first to rush in, screaming with excitement. They ran through the maze, getting lost, finding each other, and generally having the time of their lives. Neighbors followed, a little more cautiously, exploring the winding paths and discovering the hidden fountains and seating areas. Even the grumpiest old guy on the street was smiling. It was like I'd created a little oasis of fun in the middle of beige suburbia. The reactions were amazing. People were genuinely impressed. They loved the maze. They loved the whimsicality of it, the sheer audacity of it. They loved that it was something different, something unique, something that broke the monotony of oak gardens. And then, the word got out. Not just in oak gardens, but beyond. People started coming from all over to visit the maze. It became a local landmark, a must-see attraction. "Have you been to Altman's Amazing Maze?" became the new conversation starter. Local businesses started sponsoring sections of the maze, putting up little signs with their logos. It was like the maze had taken on a life of its own. Maze mania was in full swing. People were posting pictures on social media, writing reviews online, and even creating their own maze-themed merchandise. I even started charging a small entrance fee, which I donated to charity, of course, and people were happy to pay it. It was like I'd accidentally created a tourist attraction, and it was all because the HOA wanted me to lower my fence. The irony was delicious. Okay, so Maze Mania was in full swing, and everyone was loving it. Except, of course, the HOA. They were not amused, not one bit. They'd been seething ever since the grand opening, their beige little hearts filled with resentment and a deep, burning desire to find some way to shut down my leafy masterpiece. And then the inevitable happened. The inspection. The HOA board members, led by none other than Mrs. Anderson herself, showed up in their official capacity. They were dressed in their power suits, because apparently inspecting a hedge maze requires formal attire, armed with clipboards and measuring tapes, ready to find some violation, some obscure rule I'd broken, some reason to justify their existence. They marched up my driveway, looking like they were about to storm a castle, not inspect a garden feature. I greeted them with my most innocent smile. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen," I said. "Please feel free to explore the maze at your leisure." I even offered them a map, which they promptly scoffed at. "We don't need a map," Mrs. Anderson huffed. "We're professionals. We can navigate a simple hedge maze." Famous last words. They entered the maze, all confident and self-important. And then, they got lost, almost immediately. It was glorious. I watched from my porch, trying my best not to laugh, though I did have a strategically placed security camera capturing the whole thing, just in case. They wandered around, their voices echoing through the maze, growing increasingly frustrated. "Are you sure we're going the right way, Mildred?" I heard one board member ask. "Of course I'm sure," Mrs. Anderson snapped. "I'm following I'm following the path." "But this path just led us back to the fountain," another board member complained. "The fountain is a key landmark," Mrs. Anderson insisted. "We just need to reorient ourselves." They argued, they bickered, they accused each other of misdirection. They even encountered some of the maze's hidden features. I heard a shriek as one board member stumbled upon the mini library, followed by a muttered complaint about unauthorized reading materials. Another board member got lost in the bird-watching spot and emerged covered in leaves and bird droppings. It was comedy gold. They were in there for hours. Hours. They circled around, they backtracked, they even tried to climb the hedges, which, as I mentioned, were quite thorny. They were completely and utterly lost. Finally, just as the sun was starting to set, they emerged, looking disheveled, defeated, and thoroughly humiliated. Mrs. Anderson's face was redder than a tomato, her power suit was covered in leaves, and her perfectly coiffed hair was a mess. They looked like they'd been dragged through a jungle, and they had, my hedge jungle. They didn't say a word, they just glared at me, then at the maze, then back at me, and then stomped back to their cars, their tails between their legs. It was the most satisfying moment of my life. Oh man, the HOA getting lost in the maze? That was just the beginning. The real fun started when the news got out, and boy did it get out. Remember that security camera footage I mentioned? Yeah, that found its way online. And then, it went viral, fast. It was everywhere. Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, you name it. The video of the HOA board members wandering around my maze, arguing, getting lost, stumbling into bird poop, it was pure comedy gold. People were sharing it, commenting on it, making memes about it. It was glorious. The townspeople, who had already been enjoying the maze, now had even more reason to love it. They were having a field day with the HOA's misadventure. They started calling the maze Anderson's Labyrinth and the HOA's House of Horrors. Someone even created a fake TripAdvisor page for the maze, with reviews like, 5 stars, challenging and hilarious. Highly recommend bringing a GPS and a sense of direction. The HOA, of course, became the target of public ridicule. They were already not exactly popular, what with their beige obsession and their petty rules. But getting lost in a hedge maze? That took the cake. They became a laughingstock. People were calling them the Lost Patrol, the Maze Morons, and other less polite names. It was brutal, but honestly, they kind of deserved it. Their authority, which was already questionable, was completely undermined. How could anyone take them seriously after that? They were supposed to be the guardians of aesthetic harmony, and they couldn't even navigate a hedge maze. It was like a scene from a sitcom. The whole thing was just perfect. The HOA, the self-appointed arbiters of good taste and proper landscaping, were humiliated by a giant hedge maze. It was poetic justice at its finest, and I, armed with my security camera footage and my ever-growing collection of maze-themed merchandise, I even started selling I Got Lost in Anderson's Labyrinth t-shirts, was loving every minute of it. Okay, so the HOA was humiliated, the town was amused, and I was swimming in maze-themed merchandise money, all donated to charity, of course. But the best was yet to come. See, the town council, they were watching all this unfold with a mixture of amusement and opportunity. They realized that my maze wasn't just a funny story. It was a thing. People were coming from all over to see it. Local businesses were booming, and it had become a symbol of community spirit, a giant green middle finger to the HOA's beige tyranny, and they saw an opportunity to make the maze official. They called me up, these town council members, all polite and official-sounding, and told me they were considering designating my maze as an official community landmark. A landmark. I almost choked on my coffee. Turns out, they had this whole thing planned out. They argued that the maze was a unique and valuable asset to the town, a tourist attraction, a source of local pride, and of course, a hilarious example of David versus Goliath, or in this case, me versus the HOA. And they were right. It was all those things. So, they held a town meeting where everyone showed up to voice their support for the maze. Even the grumpiest old guy on the street spoke up, saying it was the best thing to happen to Oak Gardens since, well, ever. And the HOA? They were there too, looking miserable and defeated, their beige dreams crumbling before their very eyes. The town council voted, and it was unanimous. My maze was officially a community landmark. A big, green, leafy, legally protected landmark. Which meant the HOA couldn't touch it. They couldn't complain about it. They couldn't even look at it without their heads exploding from sheer beige-related frustration. It was the ultimate victory. The HOA was defeated. Their attempt to control my property, to enforce their ridiculous rules, had backfired spectacularly. They were forced to accept the maze's existence, to acknowledge its value to the community, and, I suspect, to secretly seethe with resentment every time they drove by and saw people enjoying it. I imagine Mrs. Anderson, wherever she is in Florida, probably throws darts at a picture of my maze every day. And honestly, that thought makes me smile. It's petty, I know, but after all the grief they gave me, after all the passive-aggressive letters and the fake fines, I think I've earned a little petty satisfaction and a big, green, legally protected hedge maze. So looking back on the whole maze mania thing, it's kind of crazy how it all unfolded. It started with a fence, for crying out loud. A perfectly legal, perfectly normal fence. And it ended with a giant hedge maze, a town landmark, and the utter defeat of the Oak Gardens HOA. Talk about escalation. Did I achieve my goal? Absolutely. I wanted to keep my fence, or rather replace it with something even better. And I did. Did I go too far? Probably. I mean, building a massive maze just to spite the HOA? That's a bit extra, even for me. But honestly, I don't regret it. Not one bit. The whole thing taught me a few things. It taught me that community is important, even in a cookie-cutter suburb, where everyone's trying to pretend they're perfect. It taught me that standing up for what you believe in is worth it, even if it means dealing with a bunch of uptight bureaucrats who are obsessed with beige. And it taught me that a good hedge maze can be a powerful weapon against tyranny. Okay, maybe not tyranny, but you get the idea. It also taught me that people are awesome. The way the town rallied behind me, the way they embraced the maze, the way they laughed at the HOA's expense. It was heartwarming. It reminded me that even in a world that often feels divided and cynical, there's still a lot of good out there. And sometimes, all it takes is a giant hedge maze to bring it out. So here's my final thought. Don't let anyone tell you that your fence is too tall, or that your lawn is too green, or that your life is too beige. Embrace your quirks, celebrate your individuality, and if all else fails, build a maze. A big, glorious, legally protected maze. HOA tried to make me lower my fence. I built a giant hedge maze instead. It became a town landmark. The HOA lost. Don't mess with a man's property or his maze.